Welcome to the lecture, guys. Before I begin, allow me to recite a poem I wrote about the material in this lecture, as perhaps this will articulate better than my theorizing ever could, just what it is that I am trying to designate by the orienting signal. What guides one's heart when lost at sea, what hides within the seed a tree, abides the eyes when they can't see, resides within a lockless key. What helps us heal and sets us free, that inkling of divinity, what lets our sight pass through debris, that spark of creativity. Whatever clothes it wears for you, at least this much is surely true. When you cannot yourself see through, you turn to this to seek a clue. The subtle plot of cosmic life is writ in each and every hue. To stalk it is to walk the knife, to take the strange and unknown cue. A lighthouse on a stormy night, like writing found within your soul, delighting in the ancient rite of taking part and making whole. The gift of metaphor and sight, the secret of the poet's plight. To forge a star and focus light, one's inspiration must take flight. Just what we are, one cannot say. The signs we see spell out the way. The lines we read and write each day echo with themes with which we play. So note your dreams and hear their call, their push and pull upon your mind. They often prophesize the fall. What other gems might you then find? If all the stars for you aligned, what could you do? Who could you be? If you could live your life as signed, an avatar of destiny. To hear the whispers on the wind, to smell the scent of times since past, to come to see how we have sinned, to break the spell that has been cast. To do all this and more we must, become the guide who we might trust, to lead the way and light the path, to turn the tide and quell the wrath. The man who talks to trees and birds, the girl who chased the fireflies, the one who wields not blades but words, the dreamer of infinite skies. As to the task your soul does rise, so too does it rise to meet you. For life as dance does catalyze a fresh vision of one's purview. The world will tell you where to go, and where this ends no one can know. Quiet your soul and listen here. Your fate is drawing ever near. This lecture will discuss the notion of the orienting signal, a certain type of feedback that one receives from the world at large that indicates the direction in which one must head in order to realize their valued goals. This feedback is, mechanically speaking, a consequence of the recursive interchange that occurs between the strategy which is constituted by one's conscious projections about the world and the entailed consequences of that strategy in experiential terms. This is to say that the orienting signal indicates, in the most simplistic terms, either with success or with failure, the viability of one's conscious attitude in relation to the world. So when we encounter a repeating theme in our life wherein our efforts fail to culminate in the aim for which they were intended, we can understand this as the world indicating to us that we ought to reconsider our approach, as it is likely part of the problem. More specifically, we can expect to find novel indications of a flaw within the pattern of thinking with which we approach the problem, encoded in the results that our efforts produce. This orienting signal broadly corresponds to the sense each of us have of the meaning and direction of our own individual lives, because we have an intuitive perception of when things are working for us and when they are not working anymore. Therefore, the material in this lecture will pertain to a meta-model of epistemological orientation, which takes as its relevant facts those clues which the world offers us in the signs that have been written. This lecture is an attempt to conceptually encapsulate the experience one sometimes has of being led by a trail of breadcrumbs towards a state of immersion in the Tao, that flow state in which the individual processes and navigates the facts in real time, transforming the interpretive structure when and where it becomes necessary to do so in order to maintain contact with the flow of facts. Consequently, it will touch on the subjects of epistemology and phenomenology in equal measure, discuss the signal noise problem, and explore the notions of meditation and mindfulness. We will also discuss the experience of goosebumps and the relationship that exists between resonant conceptual associations and authentic interpersonal connections. Finally, there will be a preliminary exploration of cycles and sequences, which will set the stage for the next lecture in the series. First, allow us to briefly consider just what is meant by the orienting signal in more poetic, metaphorical terms. It is the feeling that one is being guided, led along an unbound path by a series of mysterious breadcrumbs and lit only by the glow of a firefly. It is the sense one has of the central human myth, and it is the intuitive faculty for discerning meaning in media of all different kinds, and the capacity that exists in individuals for ascertaining the correct direction even when one has managed to become completely lost. It is the whispers on the wind, the voices of the trees, the movement of the moon, and the ebb and flow of the ocean tides. In all of these, there is one and the same pattern, a certain natural rhythm, with which humanity is always attempting to synchronize. It is the feeling of engagement which is immanent in the present moment, the here and the now, that guides an individual to the time and place where they have the felt experience that they are exactly where they are supposed to be. It is at this moment that one can glimpse, in retrospect, that one was not simply wandering aimlessly, but that one was finding the way without knowing how they knew which way to go. It is the threads connected to synchronicity, whose resonance guides you step by step along the path towards immersion in the river of life, in the flow of Tao. These threads lead one towards the zone of proximal development, towards the boundary between chaos and order where transformation occurs. It's the same intuitive awareness you consult when you do a vibe check, so to speak. It is the sixth sense in the tongue of the mystic. The orienting signal is more than merely how you know where to go. It is how you know where to look. It's the intuitive sense you have for what you ought to pay attention to. How does one know in which direction to go when they are at a crossroads in lands unknown? Most people navigate their existence by relying on their perception of what is meaningful to them in order to determine how they will allocate their various energies. This is the orienting mechanism at work, as it is the force which animates the events of our life by impelling us to focus upon that to which our attention is most magnetically drawn. If we are attentive and quiet, we will often notice certain details which appear to our rational mind to be of no consequence, and yet they have leapt out at our mind's eye, as if they have some inner significance for us, a sense of which we do not yet have. These details, when given their due, tend to serve as food for thought which subtly nourish our curiosity, making us wonder at why we took notice and helping us open ourselves up to obscure connections between such things. In other words, if we are able to both manifest and maintain receptivity in relation to that peculiar phenomenon of inexplicably finding meaning in things which appear inconsequential, then we are able to unlock a dormant capacity within ourselves to know which way to go without knowing how we know. This is far too often decried by the modern man as medieval superstition, as nothing more than merely wishful thinking on behalf of the individual who perceives such a sign and heeds it. However, this simply betrays the profound ignorance of modernity in the naive assumption that man throughout the ages knew so much less than the men of today. This quote is from Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, and it expresses the sentiment well. The ancient Greeks, who were the inventors of classical reason, knew better than to use it exclusively to foretell the future. They listened to the wind and predicted the future from that. That sounds insane now. But why should the inventors of reason sound insane? This next quote is from a book called The Interpretation of Fairy Tales. At the end of all these variations, there is a short annotation explaining that the motif of blowing a feather to indicate the direction the sun should take was a general medieval custom in many countries. If people did not know where to go, if they were lost at a crossroads or had no special plan, they would take a feather, blow on it, and walk in whichever direction the wind took it. That was a very common kind of oracle by which you could be guided. There are many medieval stories referring to this, and even folklore expressions such as, "I shall go where the feather blows." Since the feather is very light, every breath of wind carries it. It is that which is very sensitive to what one could call invisible and imperceptible psychological spiritual currents. Wind, in most religious and mythological connections, represents spiritual power, which is why we use the word inspiration. In the Whitsun miracles, the Holy Ghost filled the house like a wind. Spirits make a kind of cold wind when they come, and the appearance of ghosts is generally accompanied by breathings or currents of wind. The word spiritus is connected with spirare, to breathe. In Genesis, the Roach Elohim, the Spirit of God, broods over the waters. Therefore, you can say that an almost imperceptible wind, whose direction you can only discover by blowing a feather, would be a slight, barely noticeable, almost inconceivable psychic tendency, a final tendency in the current psychological flow of life. When one finds themselves in an unknown land, traversing territory that they have never before encountered, one suddenly needs to cultivate a certain kind of metacognition in epistemological orientation in order to survive. By virtue of this ability to map unfamiliar territory, we are able to solve novel problems efficiently and quickly adapt to even the most challenging of situations. A keen sense for this orienting signal is what makes an individual a quick learner, as they say, because such an individual is more aware than most of those subtle indications that one has begun to stray from the path, and is therefore more likely to correct themselves in a timely manner. The sooner you recognize that you are heading in the wrong direction, the sooner you can begin again to head in the right direction. Thus, those with an intuitive talent for this process waste less time being lost. Oscillation and equilibrium. When you find yourself in a land unknown, you have little choice but to consult the tides of fate, manifest in the above example as the wind, in order to derive your destined direction. This means relying on the barest of clues and listening closely for the first note that is out of tune, the note that indicates that one has begun to diverge from the path. In this way, we must intuitively divine our direction and then proceed on our way blindly, ears pricked for the first sign in the music of the world that you've missed your turn, so to speak, and have begun to head away from what you are searching for. Presuming that the territory is completely foreign to you, and indeed incompatible with your conscious worldview, your only practical option once you have recognized this signal to turn back is to reverse trajectory. You were going the right way for a certain amount of time, and then you started to go too far. Now you are forced to reverse the polarity of your momentum and head in the opposite direction in the hope that this time you might be able to identify that place where you were supposed to turn off, as it were. Now, because you are still in unfamiliar territory, you are likely to again overshoot the mark. The ideal, however, is to reduce the amount that you overshoot your target with each reversal, eventually equalizing the polarization and reaching a state of epistemological equilibrium wherein one recognizes the signs that they have gone too far as soon as possible every time, thereby minimizing the polarization which is inherent to the process. This bipolarity is inherent to the procedurally iterative calibration that enables the ego to manifest dynamic adaptation in relation to a domain about which you know too little to perform real-time identification of the moment when your approach to understanding the data has taken a wrong turn and is now heading off on a tangent which will have no productive outcome. As one begins to move beyond the boundaries of their path, continuing in a direction which is now creating undue distance between their model of events and the reality that it supposedly represents, the application of their model will begin to incur consequences. This is to say that it will not function properly. The indications that the model is experiencing functional difficulties are, of course, under the purview of that same model, and therefore they are typically neglected when one performs an analysis of the situation. Consequently, the fact that our model is not working properly is not known to us, and the signs that are manifest in the world each time it fails are amplified because one continues on in the incorrect direction. The longer that we fail to recognize the flaw which is inherent to our approach, the more that the evidence of that flaw will be repeated in our experiences and thereby emphasized as a recursive theme that is further amplified by each cycle. Once the failure of one's current model has become apparent, something which usually occurs through the direct confrontation with the failure of one's theoretical model to account for some of the data, usually with significant consequences in relation to the concrete problem being analyzed, the intuitive response is to consider the polar opposite of the notion you were previously using to analyze this material, and to attempt to utilize, or at least explore, this framework instead. In this way, you can compare the products of the two opposite ideas about the territory, and thereby puzzle out which is more representative of the material, and identify where each idea diverges from the normal distribution of the data. This comparison between the two opposite ways of interpreting a set of phenomena serves as the backdrop against which one is able to discern the orienting signal by providing a more complete and representative account of the data pertinent to the problem space, as each methodology for approaching and interpreting the phenomena will pay attention to and emphasize different elements and qualities of the territory that would go unnoticed and unrecognized in the opposite framework. This is part of the one-sidedness problem of consciousness, wherein the particular merits of one framework for perceiving a certain phenomena overshadow the flaws with the method in question, and these flaws can be made apparent by adopting the opposite perspectival frame and observing what becomes obvious within that context, and how far it can take you. This process of flipping back and forth between two opposite modes of interpretation allows the individual to identify and extract the elements common to both, which are essential to the phenomenon, informing a balanced map of the territory. This description amounts to a system in oscillation, swinging between two poles and gradually approaching equilibrium. The signs that would indicate to a knowledgeable explorer that he has missed his turn remain unrecognized because there are as yet no specific learnt expectations by which the individual could immediately recognize the signs for what they are. Consequently, they amplify until the unsettling signs are no longer merely indicated, but become a felt experience in the moment, wherein one discovers that they have been going altogether in the wrong direction, and those precursor signs, which were unidentified until that moment, come to the surface of consciousness all at once. Then the individual attempts to generalize the set of precursor anomalies in order to generate some kind of prototypical rule by which one could determine if one has begun heading in the wrong direction. With this in mind, the individual inverts their angle of approach and heads back in the direction from which they came, continuing forward but with an inverted orientation in the interest of neutralizing the divergence generated by one's failure to recognize that they have gone too far in one direction and strayed from the path, so to speak. This is depicted in the somewhat simplified graph you can see below. I'll post it in the chat in a second, where the x-axis is the stream of facts and the y-axis is the deviation from the facts required by abstraction or theory in order to generate a useful rule that can be used to model the facts on the x-axis correctly or accurately. It leans heavily on the notion of black and white thinking. So I'm just going to quickly find the graph I drew. Just one sec. I'll have to use one that has like digital lines on it showing how my lines aren't very good approximations for now. But in the video, or when I post it up on YouTube, it'll have a digital copy of it, which is actually more accurate. But here's the diagram I'm talking about. These signs are the manifestation of certain repetitive anomalies which indicate and indeed are expressions of some theoretical misstep. And each and every one of these signs constitutes an instance of the orienting signal, which is being discussed in the lecture. The appearance of the anomaly is a warning which ought to be heeded if the individual seeks as little divergence from the path of efficient understanding as possible. And the longer the anomalies are ignored, the more consequential do they therefore become. Neglecting to recognize the flaw which is at the root of the anomaly, permits further development of the framework built upon the error, which results in corresponding amplification of the anomaly until it becomes significant enough that one cannot progress any further without acknowledging it and dealing with it. This sort of epistemological orientation is something which most individuals do intuitively and unconsciously. However, when the anomaly is ignored, it becomes progressively more significant until it forces its way into consciousness by virtue of concrete consequences resulting from the problematic conception being employed in one's theoretical understanding of the phenomenon in question. It is, of course, obvious that when your approach repeatedly fails to produce the desired outcome, it is likely that there is some flaw with the approach which is causing this issue. And these errors are often identified early during the divergence from the phenomena because they produce an intuitive dissatisfaction in the individual with respect to the capacity of their theoretical conception to properly describe the phenomena. Conversely, when one's theoretical conception is properly calibrated, this is intuitively recognized by the individual as meaningful progression. This is intuitively recognized by the individual as meaningful progression towards some model which will not only account for the phenomenon at hand, but also permit the individual to manipulate or harness it. At the least, it must produce predictive accuracy with respect to the phenomena, and these metrics are, more often than not, assessed heuristically and intuitively by individuals who are investigating the territory. It is, in short, the sense one has of a meaningful lead, and the sense that one has hit a dead end. The orienting signal, then, can be understood as the part of the world which is manifest in those signs that indicate to you the direction in which you ought to go, and an awareness of this signal can, I suggest, be cultivated through the concepts that are described within this lecture and the one following it, Lecture 3. This awareness of the orienting signal is precisely the faculty which these lectures are intended to help you to develop through the articulate provision of a particular set of archetypally significant conceptual tools that will help you to track and identify the signs as they present themselves to you within your own experiences. These signs are apparent in the sense that you are already aware of them. Every time you are drawn to explore a new idea or activity, you rely on an intuitive ability to orient yourself in unknown territory. To the degree that you are skilled at picking up new concepts despite being unfamiliar with the domain to which they belong, so too are you already equipped with the instinctive recognition of the orienting signal, which appears in perception as meaning itself. This meaning which we apprehend, that to which we instinctively attribute our attention, is what we rely on to orient us towards those experiences which are necessary for the development and maturation of our perspectives. And it is in this intuitive sense for where one ought to be and what one ought to be doing. And it is this intuitive sense for where one ought to be and what one ought to be doing that proves most insightful when it comes to the action of distinguishing meaningful threads from the tangle in which they are ensnared. Epistemology and phenomenology. Framing. To elaborate on some of the notions outlined above, first, we ought to explore more explicitly the concepts of epistemology and phenomenology, and the relationship that exists and persists between these two fields of study. For those who are interested in a more technical and comprehensive account of epistemology than the one provided herein, please refer to my mini lecture entitled On the Scope of Knowledge Properly Speaking. What, then, is epistemology and what is phenomenology? Well, epistemology is defined as the study of knowledge, justification, and the rationality of belief, while phenomenology is defined as the study of the structures of experience of self, also known as the study of phenomena as distinct from that of the nature of being. Epistemology, then, is broadly concerned with how we come to know things, and with a definitive account of justification, especially with respect to knowledge. How can one justify that one knows the truth of some proposition? What are the conditions for legitimate knowledge? Phenomenology, on the other hand, is concerned with experience as such, which is to say that it is concerned with the facts of experience as they appear in the experience itself, rather than the facts of experience as they appear within a logical or rational framework that contextualizes them properly, so to speak. Already the cleavage between these two notions should become quite apparent. Epistemology concerns the structural relation that must hold between interpretation and justification in order to constitute knowledge of some subject matter, such as the nature of some experience, while phenomenology focuses on the facts of experience prior to conscious interpretation and justification both. This may, however, prove to be a misleading division, as the epistemological skill set operating in the individual is indeed brought to bear within their phenomenology, but implicitly so. What I mean by this is that one's epistemological precepts form a critical part of the frame one applies to their experience, and that this frame is projected subconsciously onto those facts of experience in order to render them as something intelligible to the individual. Hence, the stronger the implicit epistemology, the more rigidly is one's experience constrained by the limitations unconsciously projected. While conversely, the more articulate the epistemology, the more one can instantiate degrees of freedom for the phenomenology. That is, the more fluid can one's phenomenology be. In other words, a strong implicit epistemology leads to narrow-minded accuracy and typically justified confidence in said accuracy, while a strong explicit epistemology leads to a sweeping accuracy that doubts its own confidence while nonetheless being confident in the tendency to be correct despite the self-doubt. In short, an implicit epistemology has a severely and unconsciously limited scope in comparison to an explicit epistemology, a narrowness that is manifest phenomenologically. Here, strong and weak refer to different levels of proficiency with respect to epistemological activity. To reiterate the crucial point, one's epistemological presuppositions heavily constrain what kind of phenomena they will recognize as meaningful, and therefore what phenomena they will recognize full stop. And consequently, they have a direct influence on the manifestation of phenomenal experiences, as one's epistemology serves as an implicit filter for what one is willing to explore, in contrast with what one deems to be a mere artifact of the imperfect nature of human perception and investigation. One's epistemology also informs how one reacts to arguments and propositions which contradict one's own phenomenal experiences of the world, such that a strong epistemology enables the individual to consider the alien and often contrary experience as equally valid, and seek to discover what common ground exists prior to the divergence in interpretation, while a weak epistemology is more likely to simply reject or dismiss experiences that are contrary to one's own with little to no exploration of what led the other person to believe what they did. Epistemology, therefore, is an implicit perceptual or phenomenological frame. Unfortunately, a direct consequence of this framing relation that epistemology has with phenomenology is that when an individual has a strong yet flawed implicit epistemology, it is very difficult, nigh on impossible in some cases, for them to see the limitations of their perspective. This is so precisely because they are quite good at it normally, and so believe themselves justified in their level of confidence on the matter, in spite of protest. To elaborate upon what I have called a strong epistemology and a weak epistemology, by which I mean to designate, that doesn't, god damn it, it's a little awkward, by which I mean to designate the set of skills involved in productive epistemological activity. Ugh. These terms, I must warn you, are entirely of my own construction and are intended to simplify some of the nuance in the field so as to render it workable for the purposes of the lecture. Most individuals don't have time for comprehensive explorations of epistemology. However, a brief overview is pertinent to the discussion of the signal noise problem. If one possesses what I would call a weak epistemology, the best solution for strengthening it is to attempt to articulate it. An epistemology does not need to be consciously articulated to be optimally strong, but in the event that it is not already optimal, exposition is thereby the only route by which the insufficiency could be made apparent. The most basic of all epistemological invocations is popularly paraphrased as, "All I know is that I know nothing," which is an explicit, though paradoxical articulation of the recognition that one ought not to claim to know when they do not. This caution around erroneous claims to knowledge is an essential element of the epistemic humility in recognition of which Socrates was crowned the wisest man in Athens by the oracle at Delphi. This humility is, in effect, a capacity to recognize the limitations of subjective perception and a willingness to admit, when a demonstration has been made, that one lacks the grounds to claim knowledge on a particular subject. Consequently, this basic humility is the seed of all epistemological skill. If cultivated, it can grow into a certain proficiency in precisely qualifying propositions, in other words, designating the limitations of an assertion or inference, as well as a comprehensive capacity for specifying the available grounds for doubting a particular justification or explanation. This cultivated seed also confers the ability to excavate assumptions and presuppositions, combined with the capacity to explicate relevant implications of an analytical proposition. What has just been described is what I would call a strong epistemology, while in contrast, a weak epistemology is one which tends to conflate concepts in close perceptual proximity, such as appearance and reality, opinion and truth, and so on, and which tends to be somewhat indiscriminate in believing things which cohere with one's preconceptions, even if not well justified. A weak epistemology will, in addition, tend to manifest itself as a blindness to one's own presuppositions and a noticeable lack of grace in analysis and definition of terms. And finally, the most obvious difference between the two is that a strong epistemology will be conducive to a general tendency to admit that one could be wrong, while someone with a weak epistemology will be reticent to admit to this possibility. Let us now attempt to make clear the distinction between an epistemological prejudice, one which evaluates whether some interpretation is properly justified, although values actually fits quite well as well, and a phenomenological one, which focuses entirely upon the facts of experience, without regard for the validity of the interpretation being applied. Thus, let us imagine that we meet an old lady who tells us that she has tea with Jesus every Friday at noon. Those among us who are prejudiced towards epistemology, if they concern themselves with the story at all, will analyze the premises given and inferences drawn, critiquing the interpretation and providing plausible alternative explanations for the set of reasons given. Those among us who have a prejudice towards phenomenology, on the other hand, will be concerned with precisely what this old lady is experiencing that leads her to believe such a thing. What does she think is happening? And what are the actual facts of her experience that she is interpreting? In other words, epistemology focuses on the why and how of the interpretation, while phenomenology focuses on the who, what, when, and where of the event that is to be analyzed. The significance of this distinction lies in the form of the alchemical secret, which concerns the manifestation within the individual of a maximally fluid phenomenology paired with a rigid epistemology. In other words, the secret to alchemy lies in the cultivation of a rigid and therefore analytically rigorous epistemological skill set which does not unduly constrain the realm of phenomenological experience. Remember this. To summarize the previous two sections, let me say simply this. The epistemological pendulum swings back and forth, such that at first one is where one thinks they know, and then, out of nowhere almost, one finds that one is where they know that they do not know. That is, they realize that the complexity of the world is beyond the somewhat arbitrarily imposed limitations of the system of language that they are currently employing to map the problem space. We think we know, then we know that we don't, and on it goes. The music of the world and the instrument of the mind. Almost everyone has had the experience while listening to music of being delightfully surprised by the melody, a delight which is registered on your skin as goosebumps, a phenomenon technically called frisson. This experience is, of course, not limited exclusively to music. However, because of the powerful evocative quality of music in relation to our own subjective emotional states and moods, it is an archetypal example to examine. Similarly common is the experience of hearing echoes of your own soul, so to speak, in the music that you love. Indeed, that is often an essential element of such music. And these echoes are nothing more or less than the resonance that we as individuals feel with the ideas and emotions, the mood that is expressed and evoked by the song in question. This experience of resonance, which is exemplified in the touch of frisson, serves as a key indicator of the orienting reflex at work. The frisson that you feel during musical, dramatic, or poetic masterpieces is not merely a reflection of your inner appreciation of the work, but it is, in fact, a form of tactile feedback from the world, an indication that there is something to what you just witnessed which you need to explore further and understand more deeply. That this relatively common experience of goosebumps is, in actuality, a subtle form of feedback from the world, helping to orient you towards the meaningful unknown, rather than merely a function of your subjective appreciation, becomes all the more undeniable when one experiences it repeatedly in relation to one particular piece of material. As a brief example, when I was led by the signs to read The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho, a book which had a profound impact on me, I experienced goosebumps during the prologue and then again within the first 10 pages, and in total perhaps a dozen or 2 dozen times during the reading of the whole book, which I did in one sitting. So strong was the grip the story had and has had on me that I was unable to put it down. This frisson is our spontaneous recognition of a meaningful note of the song, so to speak, and it is an experience you should pay the utmost attention to, for it signals meaning that you have not yet learnt to consciously identify, but which you recognize on an intuitive level. This musical theme will be pursued in this section because it is a profound and rich metaphor. For the moment, you are encouraged to take it as a metaphorical expression, although this reduction to mere metaphor will be pursued further in the fifth lecture, where we will talk about the proposition that language is magic is transformation. One of the themes that is pursued in the novel The Alchemist is that the world speaks in many languages, and that we have to learn to understand the languages it speaks in order to live in harmony with it. It explains alchemy as learning to speak the language of the world, which is an illuminating expression, although it is merely a hint, a nudge in the right direction. A key element of the language of the world is music, and the music of the world is an incredible thing to behold. But it is something we are rarely given the opportunity to appreciate, as it is the most mysterious and subtle phenomenon known to mankind. Each time we are able to get a sense of the song, we learn it and know it and use it, and then it is ours, and we no longer appreciate that it was once part of the most mysterious domain of all, Mother Nature. This is partly why the language of metaphor must be our recourse, for it furnishes the world of descriptions with nature herself. There is a certain music to everything that exists, all people and all things, including the universe itself. If you listen carefully to the kind of music that someone is producing, you can get a sense for what kind of world they exist within. Mystic once said to me that when he couldn't figure out how to relate to someone, he would sometimes begin copying their mannerisms, both verbal and behavioral. He suggested that through this strategy of imitation, he would be enabled to recreate some sense of the other person's inner harmonic, thereby getting a better read on them as an individual. This particular metaphor of the world as music is incredibly influential in synchronistic phenomenology, partly because of the quality of resonance, which is such a key aspect of the material, a term that is ostensibly, though not exclusively, related to auditory phenomena. Specifically, resonance is the phenomenon which occurs when the natural frequency of a system is stimulated by an external tone, causing an increase in the amplitude of the sound wave, although this occurs also with other types of waves. This description is illuminating with respect to the term's import for synchronicity, as those ideas and invocations which most closely align with one's own internal architecture result in a certain kind of inner resonance, where the felt impact of the words transcends their merely intellectual meaning. This resonance is an indication that what was just said was in some sense an articulation of one's own inner experience. This resonance is an indication both of the authenticity of the statement and of the multi-leveled nature of its truth. It is as if, upon hearing the truth spoken forth, one recognizes and knows it as such, because it fits in with one's own experiences exactly. One of the central ideas in the study of this phenomenological form of resonance is that when something is really profoundly true, it resonates on every level, not just on one or two. This is the source for Rule 7 in the top 10 tips I provided at the beginning of the first lecture, which reads, "If it doesn't ring like a bell for everyone involved, it's not quite right." This ringing like a bell manifests differently for different people and is sometimes described as the click of cognition, when some articulation of a statement perfectly captures what we are intending to convey through the communication, or perfectly clarifies it for the listener. However, in all occasions, it can be understood as a kind of inner response to outer expressions of truth. The inner response is the recognition of the holistic and fractal nature of that truth, as it is known and experienced by the individual. In the profound case, one will experience goosebumps and often a series of conceptual associations that arise unbidden in the mind of the listener, spawning new conversational threads to explore. The experience of goosebumps is what happens when the music of the world includes a note that is part of our own personal song, which thus resonates within our soul. The instrument of the mind is best used and most masterfully played when it learns to take these cues that it receives from the greater symphony, which is the transcendent reality within which we exist, and of which we are but fragments. The trick is to learn to harmonize with the world without trying to do so. This extension of the musical metaphor is eminently appropriate, as it coincides with the optimal terminology for moral analysis. Goodness is nothing less than harmony of the widest possible scope, the utmost alignment between all individual points of view and the total and transcendental reality. I am reminded of Kant's categorical imperative. Act only according to that maxim whereby you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law. Even if you are occasioned to question or critique this very brief analysis of morality, it cannot be denied that this impulse to critique or to doubt is motivated by an inner desire to be consistent and concordant with reality. That is, to harmonize with reality. Insofar as we are invested in the activity of attempting to produce accurate conceptual models of the world around us, we are invested in harmonizing with the way things really are in order that our lives might go according to our plans. So then, it is not very unusual that we would want to insist on this notion of the instrument of the mind and the music of the world, as they are critical conceptions in the quest of attempting to emulate objectivity in all the myriad ways, such as music, dance, drama, and so on, that are so natural to mankind. Our truest home is found in the harmony between our song and the universal song. The orienting signal, then, is the note in the song which is unknown to you, but which you almost remember, as if you've heard this song before, but you have no knowledge of it whatsoever. It is the note of the song that is leading you towards the subtler elements of the harmony that you are currently missing, notes which escape your attention because you are too expectant that what comes next will come in the same form as what you've already come to know and recognize. To the contrary, however, synchronicity is such an elusive phenomenon primarily because it functions like a trail of breadcrumbs that is leading you ever upwards to higher realms of appreciation and mastery of the phenomenal reality, that transcendental symphony in which we find ourselves as audience and artist at once. Therefore, the orienting signal is the essential element and primary sign of synchronicity, each individual variation being a detailed expression of one and the same phenomenon, that which directs the individual towards the more sophisticated harmonic alignment, which is possible at the level of symphonic resonance. If this trail of breadcrumbs is followed both diligently and unself-consciously, then the individual is often sucked directly into a flow state characterized by an utter absence of conscious effort. It is suddenly as if the music has begun to play itself. This peculiar yet fascinating notion reminds me of the following from the book Mysteries by Colin Wilson. All forms of purposeful activity evoke a higher I. William James pointed out that a musician might play his instrument with a certain technical virtuosity for years, and then one day enter so thoroughly into the spirit of the music that it is as if the music is playing him. He reaches a kind of effortless perfection. The key to hearing the music is intentional and effortful perception. However, in this endeavor, the focus must not override the focus. Focus with a C denotes what one is consciously trying to do and describes the web of ideas that are brought to bear by the individual on their activity in order to facilitate their success. Focus with a K, on the other hand, refers to the broad-minded sense one has of where they are, what is happening, and how they are feeling. In short, it is the less conscious sense one has of everything that is happening, and the self-awareness and tranquility of mind which requires no thought. To give a better idea of the contrast being outlined here, when one is trying to learn a new skill, their focus might be on not messing up in this one specific way, while their focus is a more detached perspective, studying and observing what is happening, but not involved in the trying, not perturbed by the failure, and not concerned with getting it right. This is why we often fail to repeat a trick we've been learning when we try to show someone else. Our focus, in other words, our self-consciousness, interrupts the broader focus which allowed us to succeed to begin with. So, in attempting to hear the music of the world, one must open themselves up intentionally and effortfully, but they must not allow their efforts to become too conscious, and especially not too self-conscious, lest their expectations interfere with the experience. This subtle and precarious balance is what is referred to in other traditions as mindfulness. The phenomenon of resonance very often happens in the context of authentic interpersonal relationships that one has managed to establish with other people. More than this, however, is the fact that other people are one of the primary tools that the world uses to instruct us, as it is in our relationships with others that we first begin to see ourselves properly. Consequently, it is often the case that the music of the world is, in part, directing you to just this end. One day you are just walking along, minding your own business, and out of the sky falls an individual who is going to change your life. Sometimes they intrigue you, sometimes you dislike them intensely, and other times you like them intensely, but most of the time you can feel the chemistry right off the bat. It is as if the world is willing you to pay attention to this individual. And once you do, you quickly figure out why that is. I am reminded of this passage from the Manual of the Warrior of the Light. A warrior knows that his best teachers are the people with whom he shares the battlefield. It is dangerous to ask for advice. It is even more dangerous to give advice. When he needs help, he tries to see how his friends resolve, or fail to resolve, their problems. If he is in search of inspiration, he reads on the lips of his neighbors the words that his guardian angel is trying to say to him. When he is tired or lonely, he does not dream about distant men and women. He turns to the person beside him and shares his sorrow or his need for affection with them, with pleasure and without guilt. A warrior knows that the farthest flung star in the universe reveals itself in the things around him. In this passage, there is a crucial insight into the way that the universe guides us and teaches us, which is manifest most clearly in the line about reading the lips of his neighbors to hear the message from his guardian angel. These authentic relationships are the perfect place to build on the resonance, because these are the people who are also in the moment and willing to let go and immerse themselves in the flow. Therefore, if you wish to learn the music, first try learning the music of your loved ones, your friends and your colleagues, because the music of the world is manifest in each and every one of them, just as it is in you as well. If you wish to learn how to harmonize better with the Transcendental Symphony, this beautifully immaculate mystery, start first with the most immediately mysterious and beautiful part, the people you surround yourself with. They are your clues. The signal noise problem. These conscious ideas about method are one kind of noise which can interfere in the attempt one makes to hear the orienting signal. And in discussing the signal noise problem more explicitly, it is hoped that you will be able to establish a clearer sense of what is meant here by the term noise. In the broader sense, noise is anything which is not part of the signal. And so, on the most basic level, there is a task for the semionaut, in that in order to decipher the signs, one has to cultivate the ability to distinguish synchronistic occurrences from mere coincidences. Here, the distinction between signal and noise can be established conceptually as a matter of relevance, and the only skills required to make this distinction are those mentioned earlier in the section on epistemology. There is, however, as in most of the terms within this lecture series, a rich complexity to the meaning of the term noise, which occurs at every level of analysis with a new and novel function. An excellent high-level example of this is a psychological defense mechanism. During a progressive developmental dialogue, it is a regular enough occurrence that the discourse will trespass upon territory which, for one member or another, has a threatening or traumatic quality. When this happens, the individual's defense mechanisms may activate, in which case there will suddenly be an inexplicable presence of obstinance in the dialogue. One of the individuals no longer wants to explore what is being discussed. Thus, they are wont to begin to interfere in the productivity of the discourse, often in an unconscious and compulsive way, and this creates an interference pattern for anyone who is trying to track the dialectic in progress. In other words, the defense mechanism is a sort of noise also. More broadly, in the psychological realm, any compulsive behavior or thought pattern constitutes a form of noise which is apt to interfere in the process of detecting the orienting signal within the vast and varied music of the world. And especially influential in this respect are unconscious compulsions, as these are the most disruptive. The undue activation of unconscious complexes can thoroughly baffle a potential semionaut, as the precipitation of projection-based anomalies obscures legitimate signs, which are often neglected until much later, when they have amplified and repeated to the point of becoming distinguished from the projective deceptions pretending to be signs. In this context, then, noise would also refer to the interference patterns generated by the projective framework and employed by the individual, or in others to the unhelpful aspects of the conscious idea of method, to which one inevitably attempts to restrict oneself. These unhelpful aspects of the conscious idea are most prominent and influential when equilibrium is disturbed, as the individual is then in a state of mind where they are attempting to re-establish their footing, so to speak. If one is able to maintain their own internal equilibrium, and therefore reduce the noise of their own interpretive framework to a stable low point, they will consequently have greater access to the web of synchronistic signposts that litter our experience of the universe, little quirks of the pattern of our projection being reflected back at us, telling us how we need to alter our trajectory. A final and more primitive form of noise still is the same in a final and more primitive form of noise still in the same psychological domain is proper to the philosophical and often unconscious presuppositions which underlie one's epistemological and perceptual apparatus. In light of such an analysis, it must be noted that when it feels that the orienting signal is nowhere to be found, it is likely the case that your preconceptions are somehow obscuring it from view. In such a situation, one is prompted to return to more rudimentary considerations. Are you moving with the flow or going against it? And what would each scenario probably look like? The key is to really ask yourself, not just intellectually, but honestly. The effect of noise on the capacity to recognize the orienting signal is dramatic, and it might help to think of the following comparison. If you are bustling about, too busy to listen, then you would not even hear a pencil being dropped to the floor. But if you are silent and still, listening intently, it becomes possible to be aware of the most subtle sounds conceivable, such as a pin being dropped. Recall the medieval idea of the feather oracle. The stillness and the storm. Silence, noise, and meditation. This analysis of the signal noise problem ineluctably leads us towards the subject of meditation, as it appeals to the intuition as a primitive model of exactly the state of mind I am suggesting should be cultivated. I'm going to read that sentence again because that sounded a bit weird. This analysis of the signal noise problem ineluctably leads us towards the subject of meditation, as it appeals to the intuition as a primitive model of exactly the state of mind I am suggesting should be cultivated. For this, I quite like the metaphor of the stillness in the storm, which has profound connotations which fiercely resist literal translation into clear and plain language. Nonetheless, I shall do my best to give a nominal description of this metaphor and what it seeks to illustrate. The storm is an emotional metaphor, out of control emotions specifically. And if you can learn to be still when you are enduring a storm, then you are best situated to hear the ethereal missing notes. The storm has immense power and can easily unsettle you and threaten the solid ground upon which you stand. However, by learning to be still during such an event, one is not only able to manifest an intensified link with reality, but it is also possible to learn about oneself by what comes up during such a storm. This practice of learning to be mindful when you are going through an emotional storm is what is most crucial for the cultivation of receptivity, which is so necessary for the synchronistic experience. As it is this sort of emotional storm which perpetually threatens to upset the inner equilibrium of the soul, so to speak. If, instead, you are able to master this notion of remaining unperturbed by the buffeting of the winds of life's conflicts, it is possible to observe during the calm in the eye of the storm something truly incredible. It is as if, by staying aware of what is happening in the moment, you discover that you held the keys all along to the locked doors that bar your way forward, but you hadn't noticed because you were so caught up, swept up in the storm. Thus, if you can learn to meditate mindfully, then you will find you are able to observe the resonant threads which are somehow parallel to one another in odd ways. Furthermore, if you can meditate and maintain your own internal equilibrium during a storm, then there is a chance, in the eye of the storm, to channel the chaos into order and to thereby bring about the new dawn. When there is a lot of noise around you, reducing your own noise to zero can often make all the difference. This notion of mindful meditation, however, is somewhat difficult to explicate clearly. Often you will hear this idea around emptying the mind or thinking of nothing or something along these lines. Although there is some merit to this idea, it is not one which resonates with me. The idea of meditation that I find more amenable is one which prescribes no method in particular, and merely advocates for the absence of judgment characteristic of deep thought. More clearly, what I suggest is merely to allow the mind to wander, thinking of whatever takes its fancy, and to simply observe where it goes and what thinking it engages in, all the while keeping the eyes peeled for the first sign of anything out of the ordinary. In particular, what one should notice is what one notices for no particular reason, and this is what one should absently explore. One idea that I entertain provisionally, though it should be noted that when one cannot apply it rigidly or strictly, or it immediately invalidates itself, is that of a radio which is being tuned. It goes in and out of a variety of different sensible frequencies as the individual searches for the music that's just right. And without really knowing what one is looking for, one often manages to find something which is quite delightfully unexpected. Serendipitous, in fact. I myself often meditate while in the shower, immersing myself in the flow of water, which has symbolic significance in itself, and I will tune in and out of the various sounds. The music I am playing, the sound of the water, the other sounds in the house, nature, if I can hear her, the sounds of my inner weather, and so on. In this, I envision a different kind of emptiness. Not an emptiness of mind, but rather an absence of judgment and guidance, an absence of conscious oversight, perhaps, and therefore a presence of mind that is altogether more free. In this state, one is able to follow the resonant threads from one context to another with no regard for their logical relation, because the intellectual judgments too are absent for the moment, and one is able to simply follow their own train of authentic thoughts for once, wherever that might take them. So then, this stillness, silence, or absence is not of thinking, but of judging. And here we can see a clear analogy in the Buddhist tradition, a parallel between judging and attachment. It is this fact of attachment to what we are, what we know, and what we have that discourages our growth, which always means to lose something of our past self so that we may become the future self of our destiny. So meditation is partly about listening, but mostly about hearing. Mystic, my ex-mentor, always said to me that the best tradition to study if one wanted to learn the ancient art and sacred science of stalking synchronicity was Buddhism, and there are a number of texts he recommended to me, the material from which I have since absorbed, which I think would be helpful to suggest to you. The first that I would recommend is not one he spoke to me about, but nonetheless it is a fantastic lay introduction to the material. The book I speak of is Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. The second is Zen and the Art of Archery, a very brief book which is disproportionately informative with respect to some of the core tenets or ideas within the text. And the third I want to recommend to you today is called Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. The Buddhist notion of meditation is vast in its variance and illuminating in its exposition. One of the central focuses of these texts is the capacity of the individual to cease grasping at the world and to allow the natural being to flow forth. In addition to this important emphasis on the relaxation of conscious attention and effort, the texts offer an immediately curious account of the practice of meditation, especially Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. In this, one begins to realize that so much of the trying to do is getting in the way of just doing, as it were. As a final recommendation, I would like to say that The Way of Zen by Alan Watts gives a great introduction to the material and covers a lot of the philosophical baggage, offering an account which is at once charming and plausible. Finally, here are a few quotes to meditate on that might give some substance to the concepts we've just covered in relation to meditation, the stillness and the storm. Psalm 89, 8-9. Lord God all-powerful, there is no one like you. You are strong, Lord, and always faithful. You rule the stormy sea. You can calm its angry waves. That's on my job list. Mark 4:39. Jesus stood up and gave a command to the wind and the water. He said, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind stopped and the lake became calm. Psalm 46:10. Be still and know that I am God. Obviously, those three were from the Bible. This one is from the Manual of the Warrior of the Light. The Warrior of Light meditates. He sits in a quiet place in his tent and surrenders himself to the divine light. When he does this, he tries not to think about anything. He shuts himself off from the search for pleasure, from challenges and revelations, and allows his gifts and powers to reveal themselves. Even if he does not recognize them then, these gifts and powers are taking care of his life and will influence his day-to-day existence. While he meditates, the warrior is not himself, but a spark from the soul of the world. These are the moments that give him an understanding of his responsibilities and of how he should behave accordingly. A warrior of light knows that in the silence of his heart he will hear an order that will guide him. Reading the signs and learning your lessons. It is inevitably the case that, once one has dedicated themselves to the task of learning how to stalk synchronicity, initial success is soon overshadowed by an apparent stagnation. A lack of progress that is accompanied by the repetition of signs which one has already brought into consciousness and integrated. This is the situation wherein the individual's approach to the material contains some flaw that has resulted in a partial and incomplete recognition of the sign which is thought to be integrated. When a sign is repeating itself, it typically indicates that the depth of the message has not yet been realized, either at the intellectual level of the mind or at the moral level of behavior. This is to say that the repetition of a particular sign or set of signs which constitutes a continual amplification of the metaphorical signature from the originating issue is an indication that the lesson remains to some degree as yet unlearned. This means that the responsibility you bear for the situation in which you find yourself is a function of the frequency with which this cycle has repeated itself in your lifetime. A good way to think about this is that the signs are a message from the world addressed to you, a subtle symbolic expression reflecting the flaws in your attitude manifest as the consequences they cause. There is a lot of detail hidden in the experiences that one has, which one neglects to discover, as it is not yet immediately apparent. Nonetheless, the world is continually reflecting back to you the information which is required for you to recognize the critical flaw of your approach, and therefore to realize the lesson that you've not yet managed to learn. Often, when we struggle to learn a lesson, we end up learning it over and over again. In these situations, we can begin to recognize that we have a cyclic issue wherein this particular lesson seems archetypally linked to our temperament or worldview. This link with our own identity and our approach to interacting with the rest of the world is the reason that we experience the phenomenon as a cycle. The thematic repetition is an extension of a common element among all the situations, which is the source of the metaphor that is expressed as the repeating theme. The world is in constant communication with you and provides you with continuous feedback about everything that you do within it. Consequently, every choice you make is connected through a chain of effects which has, at its conclusion, the final effect of your choice upon you. This is the consequence of your choice for you. Every consequence that an individual experiences is a particular metaphorical expression, a certain reaction to their chosen action, which reflects in a peculiar way the nature of their choice back unto them. This is what many cultures have in the past referred to as karma. This karma, however, is simply an extension of the notion that when you inhabit a particular attitude, your effects on the world eventually have an effect again on you. This is obvious in any close interpersonal relationship. How you treat the other person is a critical factor when it comes to the way that they treat you in return. Not only this, but they will communicate to you as clearly as they can the message that they want you to hear, or the lesson that they'd like you to learn, in order to maintain the relationship that you've forged with them. Similarly, the world is intent upon teaching you the lessons which you are most reluctant to learn, and the more you avoid them, the more keenly they will seek you out. When someone is reticent to learn a particular lesson which is intrinsic to the proper development of their personality, they will incur progressively greater costs the longer that they stubbornly insist on maintaining their immature attitude. This is why rule 3 of my top 10 tips for stalking synchronicity is look for the lesson, because synchronicity and the signs are consistently associated with the growth that one is being challenged to achieve. The signs are always pointing to those elements of the world and of your experiences that remain as yet fragmentary in your understanding. These are the elements of the world that you have not yet integrated into your conscious framework. Consequently, synchronicity is most apparent when one is stuck or lost, as this is not only when the phenomenon is most amplified, but it is when one is most receptive to the details which might otherwise receive inadequate attention. Due to the fact that it is related to those aspects of the world or of the self which have not yet received their due attention in the conscious model, once one has successfully integrated the information into their model of the world, it becomes a familiar part of the territory and therefore merits no special attention. It has become unconscious and automatic. In other words, when the exception becomes the rule, it loses its opacity. The very act of integrating the exception into your conscious model renders it simply part of the landscape, now something to be looked past, not at. It is only when the sign repeats itself that we know that the information is not yet integrated, and thus are we prompted once more to examine the sequence of events so as to discern what lesson one has failed to learn thus far. The signs lead one ever onward and upward, always elevating one's understanding. Cycles and sequences. The final subject on which we are to touch in today's lecture is that of cycles and sequences, which is of course a major focus of our next lecture. These two concepts are, in fact, modalities which you find in experience. The former is, on its negative face, the experience of the embodied complex, wherein one is stuck repeating a certain situation or pattern in life because one has not yet figured out what they are supposed to learn from it that would enable them to move past it. The positive phase, of course, is something like a routine. The latter, a sequence, is a more immediate phenomenon involving a particular series of actions intended to realize a certain valued goal. In the context, however, of the cycle, a sequence is more specifically that series of actions which is required for the self-realization and self-transcendence proper to the transformation which is necessary to move past the limitations of your former self, embodied in the cycle you were sealed within, and therefore to free yourself that you might move towards a better approximation of your true potential. This sequence of self-transcendence and subsequent transformation is one of the key focal points of alchemy, a process which is represented in the iconic symbol of the phoenix. And in light of this notion, the next lecture is dubbed the alchemical sequence. The alchemical sequence is the solution to the problem of endless cycles in which we find ourselves entrapped in this life of ours. Oftentimes, the lessons we need to learn in order to free ourselves from endless cycles are hard to stomach, and we do not want to know. This is partly why we avoid learning the lesson for as long as we do. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, this can only be maintained for a certain amount of time before the lesson begins to force itself upon you. When this happens, one can identify the experience by way of a sort of deja vu, where one realizes that they're being confronted with a lesson they've encountered before, which they therefore must not have learnt. These cycles, then, are repetitive patterns in the situations or relationships in one's life which are detrimental in nature to the healthy functioning of the individual, but beyond which one has not yet managed to grow. Thus, the alchemical sequence is that series of actions which would be required to unstick the individual who cannot progress, and it is typically a transformative experience wherein the individual feels a supreme sense of liberation, of moving beyond the limitations of their past self or their stale ideas. Often this is described as burning away that which one no longer needs so that it is possible to move forward, to be reborn, as it were. This dichotomy will be explored within the next lecture, along with the dichotomy between continuity and discontinuity. These concepts will be analyzed in the context of spiritual or psychological alchemy, and they will see their culmination in the notion of a vehicle of progress, which metaphorically codifies one's developmental process as they naturally and organically progress through life. This vehicle of progress will take a different metaphorical form for each individual, but the basic object of the exercise will remain the same. I introduced today's lecture with a poem, and I wish to close it out with one as well. This piece is called By Candlelight. By candlelight we pray tonight, we search for the transcendent ground. Enigma might reveal insight if inquiry is rightly bound. Now listen, do you hear that sound? The maker's mark is all around. A song not mine and yet not yours. Out of the darkness, brightness pours. A spark, a star, a flame, a gem, the root from which all things must stem, a treasure forged in hearts of men, only to then be lost again. The word is not paper and pen, it is the cat, the mouse, the wren. Under the waves and in the sky, the gold you see falls in your eye. The cold is cured quick as can be, the soul is thawed by destiny, the whole is awed by just one part when we become a work of art. Thy law is writ upon my heart, and from my path I shan't depart. Yet, Lord, I ask, what do I seek? Help me to understand mystique. That chord you strike so deep within, it resonates upon my skin. The echo calls my essence forth, and suddenly I know true north. The sacred falls wash over us, embodiment thus manifest, for only then might we discuss secrets within a gilded chest, a focus that we should have guessed, a symmetry among the stars, a locus for the coming storm, a cage with freedom for the bars. So make your choice and so transform. Now hold your breath and listen here. That stillness that you hear at rest, that's how you know that he draws near. That concludes the lecture for today. Thanks for coming and thanks for listening. I hope this material is of some use to you in your quest, whatever form that may take for you. Have a lovely day. And are there any questions? Hey guys, thanks for watching the lecture. I just wanted to let you know that I recently made my Patreon live, so you can now follow me on there. The link will be in the description, and also I'll post a link in the video. Also, I was just wanted to encourage you to subscribe and check out my other work, also linked in the description.